when actually starting to dig deeper and make these different realizations and connections, it does kind of make you question like your entire upbringing almost. I found for myself not to feel like I need to know everything at one time. That can be extremely overwhelming. I just preface that as much as it's great that people are learning about this, there's obviously even people with lived experience that their individual experience may be somewhat different to them.
Hey, I'm Zeb.
And I'm Maddie.
And welcome to the We Don't Know Yet podcast. Whilst both Maddie and I are healthcare practitioners, we understand that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to healthcare. Should you require any medical attention, please seek out your local healthcare practitioner.
I'm very excited to sit down today and have a chat with you, Johanna. I have been mentioning your name for ages to Zeb, going, we have to get Johanna.
Yeah, I reckon it was almost since like week one of doing a bit of podcast planning, and Maddie pulled your name out of the hat and went, yep, we're putting her in the schedule at some stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for those just tuning in, we are joined today with a very special guest all the way up in Brisbane, Johanna Badenhorst. I will let Johanna explain a little bit about who she is and what she does, because I just want her to do, it the best justice. But welcome, Johanna. It's awesome to have you on today.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's definitely an honor. I love your stuff too, Maddie, and nice to meet you today. I have been, also really keen to talk with you both because it's such an interesting space to, I guess, work in as well. Like I do work in eating disorders a bit, and I guess faced with working with especially neurodivergent women, it's just something that comes up so much. So it's definitely a much more developing area still, and it's great that you guys are sharing so much information in this space because it's so valid.
Yeah, and looking at your stuff and obviously listening to your podcast as well, which we will pop in the show notes, I can definitely resonate with a lot of it, which we'll obviously get into later. But yeah, I think it's brilliant, and honestly, we're coming a long way in terms of people talking about it more and more, but I still think there is such a gap.
Absolutely, yeah.
So maybe give us a little bit of a rundown about who you are and what you're doing in this space as well, because I think it'd be really good to give our listeners a little bit of an insight into the life of you.
Yeah, thank you. I started my business about a year, exactly a year ago. Actually, sorry, it's the birthday today of.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
brought some cupcakes.
Actually, you know what? I did see that before we jumped on air, and I was like, remember to congratulate her, and then it completely went out my head.
Typical ADHD.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So
congrats.
no, thank you. My name's Johanna. I started holistic wellness psychology a year ago. I initially started out focusing more in the perinatal mental health space. So both, I guess, antenatal and postnatal depression, anxiety, all those kind of things, birth trauma, all those things came up. But as I kind of went on and with my own journey of ADHD, I was starting to get a lot more interested in working in the space of supporting neurodivergent women. More and more people reaching out to me also for support around like disordered eating and really those kind of routine type concerns, and that often came with the picture of also a neurodivergent woman quite typically. So I've really enjoyed working within that space over this past year, and I've grown a lot more passionate about it. And so that's really where I hope to head more in as well, like really focusing a lot more on the ADHD and also autism, neurodivergence in general. I'm really passionate about it, and I feel really inspired by those women around me and men, other genders, but especially the women I really enjoy working with. That's me.
We'd like to take a break from today's episode to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, Drip Digital. They manage all of our audio and video editing as well as our social media marketing. Without them, the We Don't Know Yet podcast wouldn't be possible. So thank you again. That's amazing. And I guess I'm really curious to sort of know what led you into doing your own thing about a year ago. Like, what was the story before then?
I've been working initially I started out working as a school psychologist, and that was enjoyable. I worked across both primary and high schools. I then realized that I really was more perhaps starting to become more passionate about working with people within the therapy, private therapy space, because I felt I had a bit more influence that way. I felt there was this kind of ceiling and these constrictions working within the school system. As much as I was passionate about it, I knew that like maybe that was not the right fit for me. And so I ended up working within private practices, and then once on maternity leave last year, decided, you know what, I think this is a good time to start my own business, because whilst you're on leave and raising a small human, what not to throw in the mix other than a completely new business, right? So
As if it wasn't challenging enough.
That's right. So I already had one. I had my second the beginning of last year, and pretty shortly after got the ball rolling with my own business kind of venture. I had a lot of supportive psychologists around me who helped kind of navigate that space. So I was really grateful to them. And eventually I was able to, get going in June. I went back a bit earlier than I wanted, but for the reason that I wanted to slow into a return to work. And I was grateful I did it that way, because it meant that I wasn't pressured to have this full caseload from the start. So I really actually enjoyed that.
Yeah, that's
what a great time to start to get into your own space as well, from the perspective that like online resources in terms of like some social media, health and wellness stuff these days, and the accessibility of having telehealth consults and things like that post-COVID really take off. Like it almost was like the perfect, setup for you in that space.
Yes, and a lot of us psychologists and otherwise dietitians and the rest of the allied health profession, I dare say, many had benefited from this telehealth move as well. And for neurodivergent people, it's actually, I think for many, was a really pleasant move, because now it's meant that they can do stuff from home where they may feel more comfortable. They have the option for many to still come in person. And so I offered initially completely telehealth, but I realized pretty quickly there was kind of that demand. A lot of people were over COVID of course everyone's kind of over it, and was hoping to get back to more in-person stuff. Some actually preferred not, but many of my clients I found wanted to see me in person. So I have been offering in-person support in Brisbane on the north side, and also telehealth. So it's kind of probably more in person than telehealth, but it's fairly even some weeks.
Yeah, and even just to have the option of telehealth, as you said, if someone does feel more comfortable at home, especially I can imagine with different mental health comorbidities, that would definitely be the case.
Yeah. And many mothers that I see, that it just makes it a lot easier than trying to get out of the house.
Accessibility, like doesn't have to, get the kid in the car, pay for parking, so on and so forth.
Yeah,
that's
right.
the thing as well. We were just talking about the fact that it's so much easier for allied health practitioners to actually utilize these services of telehealth and stuff, but it's almost even more like of a benefit to patients who might not have access to a lot of this stuff. They're really looking to dial into some of these services, but just don't have the time in their week to get away from work or, like you said, kids. So it's awesome to kind of have this as an option for them as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned obviously that you have a special interest, particularly in like neurodivergence and ADHD and autism, things like that. Do you yourself have a diagnosis of that sort of kind? My words aren't wording.
Yeah, that's okay. Happy for you to rephrase if needed, but I was diagnosed with ADHD the last 2 years, and kind of around the time I was pregnant with my second, I decided to finally pursue it. And I had inklings that I work in the space, and I was enough of times faced with the kind of assessments and that. And I went, you know what, like it's probably time for me to face that truth. And there's a lot of validity in self-identify. But for me, obviously, it was also important to, I guess, grow out of that imposter syndrome, because I was like, well, I can self-identify, but am I maybe like seeing things, or, am I over-identifying with all these different conditions just because I read the DSM-5 and now starting to question my own identity a lot. So I felt it was about time that I got that address, and also it would give me the access perhaps to the medication, which for me was going to be important. I was trying all these other strategies and I was finding it still really overwhelming. And because I love to take on lots of challenges and I love a good juggle. So I was like, in order for me to still be able to do that, I do think that I need more intense support for my executive functioning differences. So yeah, eventually the psychiatrist was able to, I guess, support me with that. And I've personally found it really beneficial. Some people don't, but like for me, that was a big difference. And I guess I've since learned too that there's, some other traits of, other things that have come up, like more noticeable autistic traits too, that I am, I guess, questioning around. So that I guess has been also important on my own journey, and I guess supporting other clients with that too, that I'm not in denial that that is a very possible diagnosis too, and kind of more self-identifying with that as such. I haven't formally gone through anything else yet. And because we do know that for many, it is a dual diagnosis of autism, ADHD, and possible other coexisting conditions as well. For about 50 to 70% are both autistic ADHD or ADHD, as some would refer to. Yeah.
Wow, that's like a much larger prevalence than I actually thought. Actually, I
Yeah.
saw a meme. I saw a meme last night on Instagram, because memes are completely factual. And it was like, I think I followed this ADHD memes page, and it was like, when you take your ADHD medication and your autistic traits start to come up because you're no longer masking. I was like, oh, I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a common story. So it probably is more often than not that, the person is probably ADHD as opposed to ADHD only.
Yeah, wow. And look, I think it's such a similar, like such a common story, rather, like anyone working with clients with ADHD or autism, like you obviously sit with them, listen to them and sort of hear their story, and like these sort of little light bulbs go up in your head. And look, obviously I'm not a therapist, but I've worked with a lot of clients with ADHD or autism, and yeah, that kind of led me to my own journey as well. They were telling me about, their struggles and things like that. And I was just sitting there going, oh shit.
Yeah, isn't that normal human struggles? I thought that everyone struggled.
Oh, it's so interesting. But it can be really, really empowering and really validating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly felt that. And it gave me a lot more permission to and forgiveness towards my mistakes and to things that I felt like, weren't good enough previously, or I felt quite broken around. Whereas now I guess I have more of an explanation and more accommodations and supports in place that help me. So it definitely can make a big difference once actually doing those stuff. And people, tell me all the time how much more self-compassionate they've been. And I guess that is, very empowering, and it's very helpful in so many other ways too, because often then their routines change in a positive direction. They maybe aren't so hard on themselves around food, around, sleep and other routines, and make healthy adjustments so that it is a lot more sustainable and they're not burning themselves out all the time.
Yes, and I think burnout is such a hot topic at the moment, particularly in the ADHD space. With your, I guess, obviously because you were diagnosed as an adult, like that would be considered a late diagnosis. If you wouldn't mind sharing, like, how did you find, I guess, post-diagnosis, that sort of emotional roller coaster? Like, did you find that it was like, oh, that's really nice, or was there a bit of mixed emotions? What did that look like?
Yeah, so for my personal experience, the ADHD journey has definitely not been easy at all times. Like, it's been really validating, but too, it is very confronting. As much as you may know these things about you, when actually faced with that, conversation with a professional, or with others in your family, and actually confronted with these different traits that you had put down to certain quirks or ignored, tried to, not really pay that much attention to, when actually starting to dig deeper and make these different realizations and connections, it does kind of make you question like your entire upbringing almost. And not necessarily in all negative way, but it can be quite overwhelming for many. This is when, I do find that lots and lots of people come to me and others in general around, okay, now I want to work on myself. I want to work on this self-acceptance, this self-understanding, because I don't want to kind of ignore this big part of me, or I want to understand how to adjust now to this new life, essentially, what's kind of opened things up. So in the short term, especially, it can be really uncomfortable. And it certainly had been for me. Like I felt perhaps like, especially like, even though I was trying to do that so I wouldn't feel like an imposter, it almost did the opposite. And I for some time have been like, oh my goodness, like now I especially feel like really exposed and really vulnerable. And like, where do I sit in terms of my self-disclosure? And as a professional, is it shameful to talk about it? It shouldn't be, but like, why is there so much stigma still? Do I have all this internalized ableism going on that I didn't realize about? I was so accepting of others, I thought, but like here I am, like judging myself hardcore. So yeah, all those things you get confronted with at almost one time, or quite consecutively after another. Once you accept something, maybe something else pops up where you're like, oh no, I remember doing that. Or
Like,
yeah, so or like, being medicated suddenly now, it's like, oh my goodness, is there like, possible autism I had no idea around, and now I need to explore that. And yeah, I guess like slowing down, accepting that you won't necessarily know everything at one time. It's okay to like take it, one bit at a time, and consume what you need to. And then, if you need to also step away from it for a bit, like, okay, that as well. Like I found for myself, like not to feel like I need to know everything at one time. That can be extremely overwhelming. And that's probably been big takeaway for me too.
Yeah. And I'm curious to know kind of like what the journey looks like from a diagnosis perspective, because I think we hear it like all the time, and we live in a very fast-paced space these days. It's almost like sometimes ADHD gets pulled into the buzz language, and people will be walking around being like, oh, like my ADHD has really got me today, and it might be just that they're literally running around frantically.
Yeah.
What does that actual diagnostic pathway look like for people? Because, for people who might want to actually go down and investigate what that looks like, it might be nice for them just to hear a little bit about what it entails.
Yeah, sure. I guess people have now, probably especially millennials and that younger generations, have started to maybe turn to the internet a lot more, and through social media have maybe learned about themselves, and that's totally valid. Like I do think that there's a lot of good information out there. Sometimes it can definitely be hyped and can lead to maybe some misunderstandings as well. So I do want to just preface that, as much as it's great that people are learning about this, there's obviously even people with lived experience, that their individual experience may be somewhat different to the next. So to just take that also, I guess, in consideration. But it can start those conversations happening of like, what is going on for me? Can I explore that a bit further? Can I turn to a trusted health professional like a GP who is, both like trauma and neuroaffirmative, trauma-informed and neuroaffirmative practitioner that can help me on the journey. Some are not necessarily that familiar. And sorry?
It's a rarity.
Rarity, yes, absolutely. So it is with them eating disorders and whatnot. Yeah, you have to get pretty lucky to have someone who's really like knowledgeable in all that space. They are general practitioners for that reason. They're not meant to know everything on the internet, but those who, I guess, are really proficient at what they do, they will help you along the way, or they will refer you to someone else who they know can talk to you about that more, or will listen and try to understand your experience and refer you to the appropriate person if you have done that research. So I would often suggest to people that, yes, they can totally seek a referral to a psychologist who can help them on that journey, and do the assessment, do a comprehensive assessment with them. That's, really kind of valid way to go. The alternative would be to go through the GP and go see a psychiatrist. I guess with ADHD in particular, if there is an interest or to explore medication pathways and that maybe open up like pharmacological options, that then the psychiatrist pathway may be really valid. Some people still choose to also see a psychologist, not necessarily for the entire assessment, but maybe for the support along the way, because it can be costly to do both the psychologist assessment, which is, the comprehensive assessment can cost a couple of grand. And because of the time it takes both to do the assessment and the report writing, the psychiatrist sees you over a number of sessions, does a similar diagnostic interview and whatnot, and screening assessments. So sometimes there could be doubling up that happens, or they can take that report, it can kind of speed up the process if the report had been completed by the psychologist, but obviously there's a larger cost involved in that case. So for some people, it actually ends up being the psychiatrist pathway that, for medication reasons, ends up being something that they pursue. But in saying that as well, it's not necessarily the case that every psychiatrist or psychologist. Is everything okay?
Yeah, Maddie's just dying off to the
So
side.
sorry, you continue. So as you were saying, apologies. I'm very, very sorry for that.
No, it's okay.
Some people decide to pursue the psychiatry pathway, especially when it comes to medication, but not everyone does. Is that right?
Yeah, so either or is really valid. Some people want more holistic strategies, and then the recommendations that can come out of a psychology report are really valid, or seeing someone for the more executive functioning type strategies like a psychologist or even an ADHD coach or both. That is also a really common path that people take. So many don't go to psychiatrist pathway. So that's in Australia. In America, it's slightly different as well. So yeah, I guess it is just
Personal preference kind of thing.
yeah, basically, but you won't. Yes, as psychologists, we can't prescribe medication, so
Yeah.
that is the reason why some choose to
Yeah,
see
and
a
interesting as
psychiatrist.
well. I think good to preface it. It doesn't just I think people rock up sometimes to the first consultation and expect that diagnosis to come after one
Yeah.
first initial consult. It's kind of like, well, as all things in life, is what we've learned over the last few weeks. It actually takes a few consults before that diagnosis actually comes about, of unpacking
Yes.
different things and speaking with them. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And unfortunately, for some people, it takes a couple of professionals before they actually get the diagnosis, that it had maybe been quite valid all along, but that different professionals maybe were looking at different things, and that it can be important to get that second opinion at times. I think maybe the presenting traits weren't so strong at that time, or they determined that your daily functioning may not have been impacted the way that you were trying to maybe communicate, and maybe it wasn't so clear to them, or there was no clear history of ADHD before the age of 12, and that can often be a problem as well for certain practitioners if they don't get a sense that there was those things in the person's past that were really clear. There was really clear evidence through either report cards or their parents' report and whatever else. It's possible that a person can't get the diagnosis because it is something that is developmental, and there should be evidence of it along the way. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, women are very good at masking, so it can be a lot harder, especially the more internalized presentations of ADHD are very hard to pick up in early childhood. And I do find as well, for many women who have those autistic traits too, tend to perhaps it almost sometimes what kind of cancels out almost, or like there's such high masking going on that they seemingly had it together as a child, but then as they've grown older and the structures and routines were kind of fallen away, and then in university and beyond is when the wheels really started falling off. So that is hard to then convince a practitioner to be like, no, it was always there, but it only showed up later in life more significantly. That is hard for people both to try and explain, but also for practitioners to have enough of that evidence then to be able to diagnose.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I only found out about the whole report card investigations not long ago when I was speaking to a friend of mine. And they were taking their son through the whole process of being diagnosed with ADHD. And, she was kind of like, it wasn't until I sat down and pulled out the report cards and read through, disruptive or like should be paying more attention in class or disruptive in class and she was just like, it's like that movie where all the numbers just start to line up. It adds
all up.
Yeah. But that's really interesting. So
I can definitely attest to that though. Like I personally didn't get all of my report cards looked at, but looking back on them post-diagnosis, I was like, how the hell did nobody pick up on this? It's like disruptive. But I definitely agree with what you said in terms of masking in women is so high. Like from the outset, no one would have known. Like my grades were all pretty well good, but obviously it was like such high functioning masking until everything came crashing down.
Yeah, and that's a common story. And for some, those hyperactive, impulsive traits aren't even present at all as well. So for many, actually, it's really hard to see like report cards there would be no evidence really of it. They'd always been that typical good girl who really went under the radar and who made it seem as though she was like, paying attention, or there was special interests within the classroom. There was enough there that kept them stimulated, perhaps, but well, they had to try really hard, like that duck pedaling really fast underwater, but in lots of distress underneath, but that on the surface seemed okay. Yes. So that's a really common story, and that can be really hard.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess even for anyone listening that might be wondering what the heck ADHD actually is, would you mind giving like a brief overview?
Sure. Yeah. So it stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Many have a misunderstanding that it means that a person's really inattentive and doesn't, struggle a lot with that attention is like the biggest kind of feature in attention, really. But in fact, it's more of the dysregulation of attention and the difficulty, I guess, that emotional dysregulation can be a really big feature of the ADHD. So yes, where we put our focus can be, what's the difficulty? Like, sorry, I should rephrase it. Where we put our attention can be what's the dysregulating part. And so it's not that there's an inattention, it's just that there's so much input that we struggle to actually put the attention on the thing that is both urgent and important. We tend to go for what seems important to us and is not actually urgent. So that's where that kind of wandering goes, and we may struggle with organization, planning, and task initiation is a big one. So a lot of procrastination that may happen. So we may seem lazy, but we actually really struggle with getting us going and seeing the task as rewarding enough for us to actually attend to it. So interestingly enough, the neurotypical person gets some kind of dopamine from even doing quite mundane tasks, or it's quite a lot more rewarding to tick that thing off. Whereas for an ADHDer, typically it would have to be really quite interesting for it to be something you'd want to complete, or there'd have to be a decent reward for that effort to be acknowledged as worth it. So that's why chores and things like that aren't very motivating, and you get really distracted doing them. Find yourself wandering a lot more. Forgetfulness is a big feature. And then there's also the impulsive and hyperactivity as well for many. So that can look like interrupting in conversations. It can look like really a hyperactive mind as well, as part of the ADHD, and more of the impulsive spending and binge eating and binge drinking, like those kind of things that seemed okay as well as doing as a teenager or like early adulthood, but ongoing now start to be quite impactful and maladaptive, or workaholism, things like that are, seemed quite adaptive in our society. And but for many, it actually ends up being something that burns them out, because there's this constant boom bust cycle where there's this overworking and over applying yourself, and then you kind of bust and then burn out, and then you do it all over again. So there's this like excitement to start something new and to get right into it and get so hyper fixated perhaps, and then do it for so long, forget to eat, forget to drink, and then you just like almost burn yourself out at the end of the day. It can be like a really common pattern for
Vicious
ADHD.
cycle.
Preaching to the choir, Johanna. Gosh.
Sorry?
Preaching to the choir.
Yes, absolutely. Just overcommitting, taking more on, taking more exciting projects on, saying yes to many things without thinking, getting like just super hyped up quickly, and finding that speed and that chaos really kind of exhilarating. But it actually is so important to slow down because, it's just not sustainable.
No, not at all. And like Zeb and I kind of do a few other things off the side of this podcast. And when we go down and sort of sit down and work it all out, I'm like, okay, let's go. And he's like, just chill. Like we'll do it slowly. I'm like, but I want to do it all now. Like,
Every single thing
Yeah.
now. It's hard. How do you find that affects people's people's lives from the perspective of, obviously there's the immediate impact, which is they find it really difficult to kind of, I suppose, like we were saying, plan a little bit more methodically, and they tend to really invest into something wholeheartedly and then find themselves burnt out on the other end. How do you find their relationships and a lot of their kind of external stuff as well throughout that process? Because it can be something that I feel like would be really impacted by that whole journey of feeling like you're kind of always on the go and trying to lock into different things.
Well, particularly if you're undiagnosed or a late diagnosis, like I can imagine that would have such a negative impact on so many aspects of life up until that point of diagnosis or even no diagnosis at all.
Yeah, so the question being like how does it impact just in the daily function of the people around them? Was that right?
Yeah, essentially. Like obviously it impacts their own personal lives and their own day-to-day kind of activities, but I'm sure there's impacts on those around them that like they might, their partners, their family, that some things that they might not really realize until that diagnosis actually comes about. But are there telltale signs or things like that pop up in presentations when they're not diagnosed yet?
Yeah, definitely. It can really show up in relationships with partner, like you said. So whether they are married or not, or in a serious relationship and living together, I mean, that tends to then highlight what the ongoing, if the demand changes, especially, that then things start dropping off, or there comes more pressure on both parties, not just the ADHD, or maybe they are in a neurodivergent relationship with another ADHD or autistic person. So that can be complicated too. They can really trigger each other as much as they may understand as well, especially if they're both diagnosed, they both have more of that self-understanding. It can be good, but it can also mean that they may trigger each other more because there may be like, one person, especially with like an ADHD and an autistic, or like an ADHD, like someone who likes routine and structure and being punctual and doesn't deal well with changing of plans, being an autistic person or really struggles with that. Then there's an ADHD who's typically runs late, who forgets things, who changes plans last minute and takes more. Like that can be complicated. It's quite a common match, I suppose. Like neurodivergent people do find each other, and it can make for a really great relationship. But it obviously needs to be managed well, and like open communication, vulnerability, and like finding good systems that work for one another is going to be really important. A lot of compassion, self-compassion, and compassion for the other person is crucial. So there's many good books out there these days, and people to follow us on social media, some who talk more to that kind of relationship side of things. Key things to look out for, I guess, is when there's a lot of resentment going on in the relationship. So it can maybe be quite important to then go seek some couples therapy so that the other person may really understand from even a mediator almost, to kind of bring up these things and provide the strategies. If they are a neuroaffirming practitioner, that is better, because then they can kind of really help to, if you make both people feel seen and understood and supported. So yeah, validating each other in the relationship is really crucial, even if you don't pursue therapy and you hopefully can work things out. But yeah, encouraging for the maybe neurotypical or even a neurodivergent person who maybe sees the other person really struggling with their ADHD or whatever. I guess it is important for them to gently bring that stuff up without it being really defensive or really like a really, I guess, yes, directive as in like you're the problem, or like, you know,
Yeah.
it's more about this is affecting our relationship, and
Yeah.
you know it's us against the symptoms, and it's not necessarily us
Like
against each
against each
other.
other.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that can make a big difference. But yes, there's definitely a lot of the time that, yeah, but when one person is going through the journey of that self-discovery, that can be also, again, a confronting time. It can really throw them, and I guess the other person, hopefully their partner can hopefully be that validating presence, that they don't then feel completely othered, and like they you know, the ADHD, for instance, doesn't feel like suddenly that the other person's going to leave them because of now finding out about all these things, or finding themselves in maybe a bit of a rut with the ADHD. And yeah, it
Yeah,
can
it's
it
like
can
it's
really strain on things. Yeah.
yeah, it's like anything in life, I suppose. Like you know,
Yeah.
you go through things, and you know, knowing that you're a partnership and you're doing it together instead of you know on either side.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think a common theme that you've mentioned today is for anyone that is living with ADHD, just that daily overwhelm, even for, you know, what might seem as quite mundane, routine, day-to-day tasks, it can be very overwhelming. Do you have any like sort of top tips almost for anyone with ADHD to reduce that daily overwhelm?
Yeah, sure. So I've already mentioned self-compassion as one,
Mhm.
and that is probably one of the most important type strategies to be using. So I bring that up in most sessions, I think, at this stage. Like, I'm very much of the compassion focused therapy is really what I love working with. But self compassion is something we don't practice all that well. No one really does, not just neurodivergent people. But I think it is especially important when going through this journey of managing your ADHD, learning about it, that you remain really self compassionate. And by that, I mean taking actionable steps of like self-care and, you know, more positive self-talk to really limit that inner critic that tends to come up a lot for us, so that you have a way of, I guess, nurturing and self-soothing, and it is not further impacting your self-esteem in a really negative way. Like, it really builds up a self-esteem to speak to yourself with a lot more kindness, forgiveness, recognize that there's a common humanity in making mistakes. Like, those things are all really crucial as humans in general, but especially for the ADHD, because what that means is that when mistakes get made throughout the day, you have that ability to come at yourself with more forgiveness and letting it go, hopefully. And then what happens is that doesn't, it builds more self-trust, more self-confidence to then do things differently next time, or like, you know, just allow yourself that grace and not further, yeah, upset yourself or add shame to that. So that's a big one. So self-compassion is huge, because it is already a hard journey, and just recognizing that, attending to your emotions and all the things like that can be really part of that picture. So as much of it doesn't seem like the typical strategy for ADHD, I often start with that, because I think that sets a good foundation for building on. Okay, so even if the strategies that we do set, executive functioning strategies, even if they don't necessarily work all the time, at least you're more self-compassionate whilst trying to implement that stuff, so that yeah, people have realistic expectations that it may not work every time. So of course, like, actual simplified routines is the other strategy that is really important with overwhelm. So once actually attended to your emotions and the overwhelm with more self-compassion, going, okay, so what can be a more simplified routine? Like, is it that I have to take some stuff up? Do certain things need to give in order for it to be more manageable? Is it that I have overcommitted, and do I need to really review what I want in my day? And can I make it as straightforward as possible or prepare the night before as much as I do remember to, so that the morning routine is a lot smoother and less rushed, because I've done some of that prep the night before or the on the weekend, so I don't have to do all the meals that week. That kind of stuff is really massive.
Yeah.
And when people are doing that consistently, often it's that all or nothing approach. But, as much as you can stick to it, that's great. And I guess just, for many, it's also those kind of visuals as well can be really important. So having visuals on the fridge or on your phone, having reminders, those kind of systems. So that's the other thing. So having good systems and reviewing those. Sometimes they start to not work so well anymore. So maybe then you have to actually change it up. Having shared calendars and that can be really helpful as a family, as a couple, because then the other person can kind of remind them or hold them accountable where possible. So yeah, those will be the biggest things. And I think certain people can get a little bit caught up with, once I have that system, then it's all be better. So, but I think it needs to work in combination, right? It needs to have that maybe body doubling element or someone to help them hold things accountable, because maybe doing it alone and trying to just trust this one app will make all the difference. I've been there before. That's going to be the thing that makes my ADHD better. That, it's maybe unrealistic. So yeah, it's just self-compassion, the system, and simplified routines are probably some of my tops, I would say, to try and practice.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. I definitely feel like that'd be so valuable for so many people listening, and also taking mental notes as you're saying all of that. I'm like, yes, definitely need to do that.
Out.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. I guess in terms of sort of what you do up in Brisbane, whether it's online or in person, do you have any exciting sort of upcoming things that might be helpful to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, people can check me out on social media. I have a podcast as well. ADHD Her Way is my potty for those who are interested. They can also reach out to work with me in person if they would like, or even nationally as well via telehealth if they listen and think that they would like to work with someone. I especially enjoy the intervention and therapy side of things, but I have a great number of people to refer them to for assessment if that is something that they would like. It may be something I will offer in the future. At the moment, I have shifted away from the assessment space and been focusing more in the intervention. And there's a lot of validity, in my opinion, around that, working with good management strategies and working on your identity as an ADHD or autistic and or mum, and that's still stuff I'm really passionate about. So yeah, those would be the things. And I am working on also creating, and by this time it really gets released, it's possible that I would have had something already off the ground and launched. I am passionate about having kind of online courses also available to ADHDers. So that is something that's in the works. So feel free to join my newsletter and that, so you're in the know about those kind of things. I have an overwhelm guide for ADHDers up at the moment, and working on, I'll probably have something else. Let's be honest, there'll be something else there for others to consume by the time they listen, probably, because it changes all the time. So yeah, that's really it. So, and they can find me at Holistic Wellness Psychology for the moment, but I am in the works of a bit of a rebrand. So it's possible it could be something slightly different next time we chat.
Oh, exciting. Well, we'll pop all of those in the show notes for sure. So if anyone is interested, they can find you there. But sounds like there's a lot going on. I love it.
Yes, that's the normal state of my being. I'm like, 1 year in, get itchy feet. I'm like, okay, holistic wellness psychology will remain around. It's more like there's other like kind of ventures I want to pursue too that, it's in the works, but haven't completely set on that yet. So, but it's just the usual thing, right? Like it's
no
always
shortage of ideas,
changing.
that is for sure.
That's right, Maddie. I'm totally on board with that.
Oh, I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm just writing things down frantically, constantly, which is good. It's we're creative, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Those little thought dumps in the middle of the night. I've had those like moments of clarity, and I read in. I'm like, that idea definitely sounded a lot better when I first woke up. But
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Joanna. Honestly, it's been so nice sitting down, and I feel a bit selfish, but I've gained a lot from it, and I'm definitely sure that a lot of the listeners have as well. I think that's about it. Hey.
Yeah, thank you so much. Nice to meet you finally. I'd heard so much about you before today's episode, but
Yes.
yeah, it's so nice to put a face to a name.
And I deeply apologise for the coughing fits as well. Goodness me.
No, all good. I know it's like, flu, cold season everywhere. So no, totally accepting of that. It was my pleasure to join you both. And I hope people find a lot of benefit in it. Like, it definitely is this changing space. So even some of the stuff discussed today, it's very possible things have changed in the future. We know more about it every year. There's more information, more research that comes out. So I am excited about the space, the neurodivergent space, of how much it is changing and how much we are learning about that, and hope to contribute more into it going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again. Have an awesome rest of your day, and I'm sure we'll chat soon.
Sounds great. All the best. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast.
Be the first to know when the next episode drops by hitting subscribe on wherever you catch your podcasts.
And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at we don't know yet.pod.
See ya.